of a three-part series on the Beis Hamikdash. And in this series, what we are looking at is the three primary zones of the Beis Hamikdash, which correspond to the three primary zones in the Mishkan. And we are looking at them not only in their technical sense, as with regards to the kalim, the vessels that were there, the avodah that was performed there, but also, and perhaps even more importantly, is being that the ultimate kavana of the Mishkan is v'shachanti b'soicha, that we become a Mishkan, that we in our lives, in our souls, in our homes, in our avodah, that we become a resting place for the Shekhinah. So we're going to look at the various lessons and avodas in our lives that correspond to these three zones. So just really to recap the introduction that I gave last time for those who were not here, but it's also to refresh where we are up to and where we are going. So we mentioned from various Sfarim, starting from the Zohar, the Medrash, and Chassidus, which says that the design of the Mishkan corresponds to the form of a person's body. Not only does it correspond to the form of a person's body, but corresponds to various layers of the neshama as well. In fact, I saw something very interesting. I don't know if I quoted it last week, but there's a sefer from the Ramah of Shulchan Aruch, Rav Moshe Isserles, who writes the Ashkenazi halachas into the Shulchan Aruch of Rabbi Yosef Karo. In addition to being a posek, was also a choker, a Jewish philosopher. And he has a phenomenal work known as Olas Tamid, in which he goes through all of the pratim of the Beis Hamikdash. And when I say pratim, I don't just mean the general places and zones and kelim. He goes down to the very measurements that the Rambam brings, or that the Mishnah brings, for the dimensions of the Azara and the Ezra Yisrael and the Kodesh and the Kodesh HaKadoshim, etc. And he explains them in a philosophical sense. But the underlying idea is that the Beis Hamikdash represents coming close to Hashem. And it represents the avodah of a person to come closer to Hashem, to rise up higher spiritually. And indeed, that is why Yaakov Avinu, when he slept at the site of Har HaBayis, and he said, V'zeh Shar HaShamayim, Beis Elokim, that this is the house of God, this is the gateway to heaven. What was his dream about? A sulam mutzav arza, a ladder that was on the ground, V'roisha magia hashamayma, because that is what the Beis Hamikdash is supposed to do. It's to take us from being mutzav arza, being invested in artius, in coarseness, in physicality, in materialism, and to elevate and raise us up to the shamayim, to the pinnacle of closeness to Hashem, the pinnacle of avodas Hashem, and in terms of our neshama, to reach and touch the shamayma of the neshama, which is the essence of our neshama. So that's really the context, and that's why the different zones of the Beis Hamikdash, you would not only as you would come in and go further and further in, so your first entry point would be from outside of the walls onto the Har HaBayis, which had a higher degree of Kedusha than outside of the walls. Then you would come from the Har HaBayis in the Beis Hamikdash to the Ezras Nashim, then from the Ezras Nashim into the Azara. Then as you went further and further to the west, you would come into the Kodesh and Kodesh HaKadoshim. And each level had a greater degree of Kedusha. And that was actually reflected in how the Beis Hamikdash was constructed. The Beis Hamikdash was not on one level plane. The Beis Hamikdash was built ascending the slope of the mountain. So that as you went from level to level, you had to climb a series of stairs. So there were stairs entering into the Azara, the Ezras Nashim. There were stairs going from the Ezras Nashim into the Azara. And there were a series of stairs that would then go up to what we're going to speak about today is the Ulam and the Kodesh. And that represents how not only physically one rose up as they entered further into the Beis Hamikdash, but spiritually one rises up higher and higher as one goes through these different stages. So just to run through just the diagrams at the top, I'm sorry, I apologize for those following online. There was a glitch last time when I tried to show the slides, and that affected the recording. So I'm just going to leave that for now, and I hope that you are able to follow with us. So on the left, we have the three primary zones of the Mishkan, and reflected in the Beis Hamikdash. We have the outdoor courtyard, the Azara. That is where the Karbanos took place, as we spoke about last week. That's where the Mizbeach for the Karbanos was. That's where the Kior for washing the hands were. And the vessels there, at least in the Mishkan, were all of copper. And that's where the day-to-day avodah of the Beis Hamikdash really took place. That was outdoors in the Azara, the courtyard. The Kodesh is already part of the Heichal, part of the building of the Mishkan, the building of the Beis Hamikdash. Inside the Kodesh, as we're going to learn about tonight, with the three primary kelim, the menorah, the shulchan, and the mizbeach hakatoras. And then we have the Kodesh HaKadoshim, which was only entered by the Kohen Gadol on Yom HaKippurim. In Beis Rishon and in the Mishkan, the Aron was placed there. In Beis Sheni, the Aron was not there present. It was buried beneath the ground of Har HaBayis. And that was really the holiest place within the Beis Hamikdash. So those are the three zones that we are going to be looking at. And we brought a number of correlations. And we'll actually just start with the worlds. We quoted from the Rebbe Rashab in Tafresh Ayin Beis in the Hemshech Maimarim, which explains that the Mishkan is a prototype for the spiritual cosmos of existence. We're familiar from Chassidus with the concept of worlds, different worlds and rungs within the Seder Ishtalshlus, the process by which Hashem brings the worlds and the world that we live in into existence. And the lowest of those worlds are grouped together. They are Bria, Yetzira, and Asiya. And the reason they're grouped together is unlike the worlds that sit above that, these are worlds which are now defined as Yesh. They have an independent Metzius, an independent existence outside of, so to speak, from Hashem. Now, obviously, Asiya has the greatest level of Metzius, of Yesh, but each of these worlds is considered somewhat separate. And therefore, these are words. Yeah. So the world of Bria is the world of creation, Yetzirah, formation, and Asiya, the world of action or implementation. And these three worlds are worlds where negativity can reside. These are worlds where there can be klipos. Each world, according to their level, there is negativity that needs to be refined. That's our avodah in the world, is to refine the negativity of the world, which can only exist in these three worlds. They correspond to the Azara, to the courtyard. The Kodesh that we're going to learn about tonight corresponds to the world of Atzilus. The world of Atzilus, the world of emanation, is a world which is completely godly. It's completely united with Hashem. It's referred to as Olam HaAchdus, the world of oneness with Hashem. And that is where the Sfiros of Hashem come into being. That is where we have the Sfiros, the Midos of Hashem, the Seichel, Chachma Bin and Das, and the Midos, the Zayin Midos, Chesed, Vur, Tiferes, Netzach, Chod, Yesod, and Malchus. And unlike Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya, in Atzilus, as we quoted last week, Lo Yegur Chara. Pasuk says, no evil resides with you, Hashem. So whilst in the created reality, there is evil and negativity that needs to be refined and removed, in the world of Atzilus, there is no negativity. There is no klippa. There is only goodness. And therefore, the avodah of the Kodesh, which corresponds to the world of Atzilus, as we're going to see, is not an avodah of birurim. The avodah of the courtyard, the Chatzer, which represents Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya, where there is negativity, that represents the avodah of birurim and engagement with the physicality of the world. The Kodesh, however, is a level which is beyond refining, beyond needing refining, because there is no negativity or klippa. It is a world that is completely one of kedusha. But even Atzilus is still a world, and therefore it is not perfect, absolute oneness with Hashem. Beyond Atzilus, we have, where I've written here is Keser, but in general, these are worlds referred to as the worlds of the Olamas Ein Sof, the infinite worlds. The worlds which are completely one and united with Hashem, not independent on any level, and that is the Kodesh HaKadoshim, which we are going to speak about next week. So that's one perspective. The Rebbe Rashab says that the three zones correspond to the three groupings of the worlds. The Alter Rebbe in Likutei Torah explains that the three zones of the Beis Hamikdash correspond to what the Sefer Yetzirah says as the Tlas Shlitin Ba'adam, three organs that are rulers or drivers within a person. And they are Moyach, Lev, Kaved. Moyach meaning the brain, which is the seat of our intellect, Lev, which is the heart, the seat of our emotions, and the Kaved, the liver, which Chassidus relates to either instinct, animalistic instinct, or action. And obviously, the lowest of that would be the Kaved. And that's why Melech, someone who has rulership, mastery over themselves, their processing follows that sequence of Moyach, Lev, Kaved, or Moyach, Shalit, Ala, Lev. The dominant driver within a person is their mind, their intellect, their understanding of right and wrong, of good and evil, their appreciation and understanding of Hashem, Torah, and mitzvahs, that then awakens their emotions to have a desire to engage within something. And then that flows through to the kaved, which really corresponds to our machshav dibur ma'aser, implementation in action. That's how it should be. So the lowest of those, the kaved, corresponds to the chatzah, to the courtyard, because the animal, which is represented by the korbanos that were offered in the courtyard, the animal is driven by its kaved. It's driven by its base animalistic instincts. The lathe, which is a little bit more lofty than our basic animalistic instincts, the heart is corresponds to the Kodesh, which is where we're going to see tonight are the primary emotions that a person experiences, particularly in the service of Hashem. Whereas just as in the person, the brain is the epicenter and it's the control center and it's the core of our psyche. So the Kodesh HaKadoshim is the epicenter of the Beis Hamikdash. It's the control center of the Beis Hamikdash. It's the loftiest and holiest place within the Beis Hamikdash. So that's another perspective that we touched on last time. And the final perspective, if we look at the circles on the right of the diagram, is that if we view our soul, the layers of our soul in the form of concentric circles, just to make it visual for those people who work visually, is that on our most peripheral, we have what the Alter Rebbe and Tanya describes as the levushim, the garments of our soul, which are our thought, speech, and action. That is how we interact with the world around us. That's how we interact with the things around us, the people around us, and the physicality around us. And that is how we express, either by choice, our animalistic soul or our emotional soul. And for the Beinani, the Beinani's avodah in this world is to control their machshava, dibur, and maisa, primarily in a way of iskafia, where we have to hold back our animalistic temptations and control our behaviors and instead use our thought, speech, and action in the service of Hashem. Being that these are levushim, like a garment that sits outside of a person, they correspond to the courtyard, which is the outside or the peripheral of the Beis Hamikdash, of the three zones. Then when we move in closer to the neshama, we have our seichel and our midos, which according to Tanya, it seems that this is what comprises the soul itself. But in Torah, the Alter Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, actually qualifies that even our seichel and midos, whilst they are how the neshama expresses itself, it is not the essence of the neshama. We are not what we understand. We are not what we feel. The neshama feels through emotion, and the neshama thinks through seichel. But the seichel and midos are not the neshama itself. So the seichel and midos are a deeper level within the neshama. They're not the external levushim, and as we'll see, they correspond to the kodesh. But then we have the etzem haneshama. The etzem haneshama, which is the yechida. The etzem of the neshama is not about seichel, it's not about midos. It has no definition other than being a chelek elokah mamish, pure, absolute godliness. And therefore that corresponds to the Kodesh HaKadoshim, which, as we mentioned last time, there was no avodah performed in the Kodesh HaKadoshim per se, or with the kalim in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the orei, because that level of the yechida, it's not about doing, and it's not about feeling, and it's not about thinking or understanding. It's about who we are in the very essence of our soul, which is one with Hashem. Just on that point, we'll come back to it later. These also correspond to the different levels of the soul, which also correspond to the worlds, but that's just a side point. Okay, so that's the background. So last week we focused on the Chatzar, the courtyard, the Azara of the Beis Hamikdash. That is where the avodas hakorbanos took place. That is where the kior stood, and that really represents our avodah within Bria Yitzur and Asiya, how we engage with the physicality of the world for the purpose of birurim, for the purpose of refining the physicality of the world. That also includes refining our nefesh habahamis. The avodah of korbanos is that we take an animal, a behema, and we shech that behema, and we elevate it onto the altar of Hashem. And that is part of our avodah, that we have to take our nefesh habahamis, which is a coarse behema, we have to take out of it its blood, which is its passions in worldliness, and we need to elevate it in the fires of the mizbeach, that it too becomes part of our service of Hashem. So the avodah of the courtyard, we're engaging with the world, we're engaging with physicality, we're engaging with klippas noiga, we're engaging with our nefesh habahamis, our animalistic soul, and we do so primarily with our machshava dibur maisa, with the more external parts of our soul, and that's the avodah represented by the courtyard. That is why the kalim in the courtyard, certainly in the Mishkan, were of nechoshes, were of copper, which we pointed out in our last year, the shorish of nechoshes is nachash. Nachash, of course, the snake is the embodiment of evil and negativity, means that we engage with that belongs to the nachash in order to make it holy. That is also why we have a kiyur. The idea of a kiyur is about washing off negativity, because when we engage with physicality, even for the purpose of birurim, there is a rub-off effect, and therefore we need to wash that off in order to remain pure and to remain unaffected. So that was the Azara. And tonight we're going to enter into the Kodesh. And the first thing to note is that when entering the Kodesh, there are a series of steps, because this brings out how the Kodesh represents a higher level of avodah than the Chatzar. And therefore one needs to elevate themselves. In general, as we're going to see, it's like the difference between Shabbos and the weekday. The courtyard, that's where the korbanos were brought. And whilst there were korbanos brought on Shabbos and Yom Tov, etc., but the time when the korbanos were brought, when people could bring their own personal korbanos, was during the weekdays. One could not bring them on Shabbos. So the weekdays, when we engage with the world, that's when Sheishes Yom Tavod, we go out to work. We're engaging with the world for the purpose of birurim. But then when we come to Shabbos, we need to transition out of that avodah of the week and elevate ourselves and aliyah so'ilamos to a higher plane in avodas Hashem, and that is represented by the Kodesh. So there's stairs that lead us there. In the Mishkan, there were no stairs because the Mishkan was only temporary. But in the Mishkan, one went straight from the Azara into the Kodesh. In the Beis Hamikdash, one had to go through the Ulam. There was an antechamber to the Kodesh. Nothing was really done in the Ulam. They would keep the Lechem Apanim there from Erev Shabbos, and then on Shabbos they would take it into the Kodesh. There was a section there where they stored their knives. There was nothing really done there. It was an Ulam. It was a foyer. I don't think they had coat hooks, but it was a foyer. But what does that mean? It means like this. One cannot just come into Shabbos. One cannot just transition and in the blink of an eye go from weekday mode into Shabbos mode. Be involved in birurim, in the physicality of the world, engaging with our nefesh habahamis, our worldly matters, and then straight away enter into the Kodesh, a spiritual avodah. Where do we see this? With regards to davening. The Shulchan Aruch brings a rule that one must enter, when one enters the shul, one must enter through double doors. Now, it doesn't mean a shul has to have double doors. Many shuls do have double sets of doors. In fact, the Kodesh had double sets of doors. The wall was very thick. There were doors on the outside of that wall and walls on the inside of the wall. What it means is that you can't just come in from being involved in the world. You're out there in the streets and you're out there busy, etc., and come straight in and daven. You need to have a break. You need to have a hefsek. You need to have a pause of that duration before you can then engage in the Kodesh. And maybe that's why we bring in Shabbos early. I'm not sure, but it's certainly why husbands should come home early on Friday and not come home at the last minute when everything's ready, because we need to transition. We need to switch off from the mundane, represented by the courtyard, and we need to lift ourselves up and prepare ourselves to now enter into the Kodesh, be it in time, where we're going from the weekday to Shabbos, or be it in our days when we're going from the avodah, yes, involvement in physicality to serve Hashem, the avodah birurim. But when we come to a holy activity, an innately holy activity, such as davening or limud haTorah, there needs to be this break where we go out of the one mindset to now enter into the new mindset. So when we talk about the Kodesh, inside the Kodesh, you have the three primary kelim, the menorah, the shulchan, and the mizbeach hakatoros. And we're going to look at the diagram over here just to understand. It's important to understand where these were placed. So the Kodesh itself in the Mishkan was 20 amos long by 10 amos wide. In the Beis Hamikdash, it was double that size. It was 40 amos long and 20 amos wide. So we're talking about 10 meters wide and 20 meters in length. And in the Kodesh, we have the three kelim. The three kelim on the left side, as you can see here illustrated by a triangle, on the left side, we have the menorah. On the right side, directly opposite the menorah, was the shulchan, depicted here with the rectangle. In between them, in the center, although not directly between them, the Torah says that the menorah and shulchan have to be opposite one another, meaning nothing can be in between them. we have the Mizbeach HaKtoros shown here as the square. And as the Rambam told us, we learned about this, you can see that in the halacha over here. In the halacha of the Rambam says, Umizbeach l'Ktoros u'menorah v'shulchan, u'shlashtan b'soich HaKodesh. These three kelim were inside the Kodesh. Lifnei Kodesh HaKadosh. Now the Kodesh was a large area. It was 20 meters long. It was 40 amos long. These kelim were not very big. Where were they positioned? They weren't positioned in the middle of the Kodesh. They were placed all the way at the, depends how you want to look at either the front or the back. It was all the way up next to the curtain that separated the Kodesh and the Kodesh HaKadoshim. So the menorah on the left side, and Shulchan on the right side, and it gives directions here. Lifnei Kodesh HaKadoshim, ha-menorah b'dorim, mismol hanichnas. The menorah was on the south wall of the Kodesh, on the left side of the one entering. The Shulchan miyamin, the Shulchan was on the right side, she'alav lechem hapanim, on which the lechem hapanim was placed, ushneim b'tzad kodesh hakadashim mibachutz. And both of these, the menorah and the Shulchan, were placed all the way up, right next to the kodesh hakadashim, on the outside. Obviously, they were not in the kodesh hakadashim. Umizbeach haktoros mashuch mibein shneim lachutz, and the mizbeach haktoros was in the middle, but it was mashuch, was drawn back towards the outside, and that's why you can see it's almost like a triangle depicted over there. So those are the three kelim in the Mishkan. Now, I want to point out something interesting, because this is going to be necessary when we translate this in terms of the spheros. Okay, in the Beis Hamikdash, as one went further and further in, one was heading towards the west. Shechina b'marav, the divine presence is in the west. That's why the Kosa Maravi was never destroyed, because the Shechina Loizaz never left from the west. In fact, Chassidus explains that's why the sun sets in the west, because that's like the bittul of the sun bowing down to the Shechina, which is in the west. So as one went into the Beis Hamikdash, one was going from east to west. And therefore, the south would be on one's left. The menorah was on the south side, which is to one's left. Normally we say the south is connected to the right side, but because one here is heading west, and on the Shulchan was on the north, which would be to one's right. Now, why is that inverse to what we normally say? Because normally the forward direction is the east. What's the Hebrew word for east used in the Torah? Okay, or kedma, kedim. Kedma means going forward, kadima, because the front direction is considered the east. And therefore, that turns out that if you were facing east, everything would be opposite. That the menorah would be on your right side, the south would be on the right, and the Shulchan would be on your left side, the north. But because we're going into the Beis Hamikdash towards the west, that's why the Rambam phrases it in this way: the menorah is on the south and the Shulchan on the north, not the it's on the south and north, the menorah on the left and the Shulchan on the right, not the other way around. Okay, so why is that important? We're now going to correlate this diagram to the spheros. As I mentioned before, the Kodesh HaKadoshim corresponds to the sphere of Keser. The Kodesh HaKadoshim is absolute pure godliness, and that is represented by the sphere of Keser, which of course sits atop all of the other spheres. You can see there in the diagram on the right. We're going to focus primarily on the emotional spheres. The primary emotions of the spheres are Chesed, Gevura, and Tiferes. Chesed is love, kindness. Gevura is about discipline or distance. It's the source of yira, the source of awe, fear, reverence of Hashem. And Tiferes, harmony, beauty, synthesis. It's about bringing Chesed and Gevura together, and often referred to as Midas Harachamim, the idea of mercy. So if we look at these three spheres, they almost, in a diagram sense, look like the depiction of the menorah, the Shulchan, and the Mizbeach HaKtoros. Because as the Mukabalim describe, that they create triangles. Tiferes is not directly between Chesed and Gevura, but it's shown on the middle column, sitting beneath them. Now, because this is all based on east-west, as opposed to the Beis Hamikdash, which is west-east, we talk about Chesed being the right hand, and Gevura being the left hand. So now we're going to go right and left brain. Okay, so in terms of the Beis Hamikdash, what would Chesed correspond to in terms of the Kalim? The menorah, because we've got to flip it over, right? So the right side of the sphere's Chesed corresponds to the south direction, which is the menorah in the Beis Hamikdash. The Shulchan, which is on the north, and looking at a mirror, exactly, is on the north side, corresponds to the midah of Gevura. The north is connected to Gevura, and generally that would be the left, but of course in the Beis Hamikdash, as you're going in, it would be on your right. Tiferes is in the middle, no dramas, it fits very easily. So Chassidus explains that these three kelim correspond to the three spheres of Chesed, Gevura, and Tiferes, and the Mizbeach of the Karbonos corresponds to the sphere of Malchus. And that's why, whilst there's a machloikus where exactly the Mizbeach was it directly in the middle of the Azara? Was it more towards the north or more towards the south? But generally speaking, it's depicted, at least according to one view of the Gemara, directly in line with the Mizbeach HaKtoros, just as Malchus sits at the bottom of the middle column. Now, Malchus...
Gevura was in the north, and that corresponded to the
Shulchan, correct.
And what's Tiferes?
Tiferes corresponds to Mizbeach HaKtoros, which is the center column, but that was towards the east. Yeah. Okay. So you have Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes. They correspond to the primary spheres of Atzilus, and therefore they're within the Kodesh, this holy, godly world. Whereas being that Malchus comes down to create the low worlds of Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya, the Mizbeach of the Karbonos, which is the Avodah Birurim, Malchus is found outside in the courtyard where the animals belong. Right, that's where the klippos are. That's where the birurim takes place. That's where the negativity is. Now, I've shown the spheres of Netzach, Hod, Yesod. This I haven't seen sourced anywhere. That was just my own idea. Is perhaps the Rambam told us that these three kelim are all the way at the top end of the Kodesh, near the Kodesh HaKadoshim, which means in the first half of the Kodesh there was nothing there. And perhaps that's the space of the three secondary middos, because Netzach is really just an offshoot of Chesed. Hod is an offshoot of Gvura, and Yesod is an offshoot of Tiferes. We're not going to dwell on that because that was just my own svara, and I'm not that confident to kind of take it any further than that. Okay, so the menorah, of course, was a candelabra. It was made of gold. It had the 7 branches, the various decorative features on the menorah, the kaftorim, the balls, the prachim, the flowers, and also the gevim, the cup shapes. And all 7 candles were lit every night. The menorah was not that tall. The menorah was 18 tefachim tall, so approximately 1.5 meters tall. There were 3 steps that the kohen would go up on to light it. Why do you need steps if the menorah is only 18 tefachim tall? Because there's ba'aloischa esaneres. You've got to lift them up, meaning you're higher and you're lifting them up towards you, umakarvan l'toira kind of perspective. So that was the menorah, and that would be lit in the evening. It was prepared in the morning, lit in the evening, it would burn through the night. That was done every single day. Weekday, Shabbos, Yom Tov. The shulchan on the right, so when we think about the shulchan, we often imagine this whole contraption. The shulchan was a table like this. It was a flat-topped table. It had a rim around it. It was made of acacia wood. It was covered with gold. And it had extra apparatus or infrastructure to support the lechem hapanim. The lechem hapanim remained the entire week, but it was placed on Shabbos. On Shabbos, it couldn't be baked on Shabbos, so the lechem hapanim was baked erev Shabbos. It would be left in the ulam, as I mentioned before. And on Shabbos, after the korban musaf, the kohenim would bring in the new lechem hapanim and remove the old lechem hapanim to replace it with the new lechem hapanim. Then they would be able to eat from the lechem hapanim from the previous week, which of course miraculously stayed fresh, and it nourished them, and they ate from that. But the lechem hapanim had to sit there, but it was performed specifically on Shabbos. Now, because the lechem hapanim were actually quite thick, they were not thick, but they were folded over to create this thickness. When they were stacked up in 2 piles of 6, they got quite tall, and they needed support structures. There were little pipes between them, so the bread doesn't sit directly on the other and squash it and cause a lack of airflow. Why do you need to do that if there's miracles? Because we're not so mechalanes. And there was also two things on the side that supported them from the side, in which these little tubes were placed. So that was the apparatus. But the shulchan was a table like this. Now, obviously, when we think about this, the menorah being light seems to be more connected to ruchnias, and the shulchan, which is about lechem hapanim, bread, seems to be more connected to gashmis. But now last year we said the karbonos in the azara, in the courtyard, that's engagement with gashmis. So what is the menorah? What does the shulchan actually represent? And we'll come to that. Just keep that in mind.
Good question. Might be really obvious, but why did they do one of the malachas of lighting on Shabbos?
They did many of malachas on Shabbos. They shechted, they killed animals, they burned incense, because the avodah overrides Shabbos. Meaning these things are completely permissible. That's why personal korbanos cannot be brought, because they don't have to be brought on Shabbos. But the korbanos of Shabbos and the musafim of the Yom Tovim had to be done on that day, and that not supersedes Shabbos. It does supersede Shabbos, but it's not considered chilul Shabbos. That is how Shabbos is observed, because the Torah says that you must bring this avodah every single day, and the musafim must be brought on these days. So the Mizbeach HaKtoros was also not that tall. It was 1.5 amos tall. It was 1 by 1 amma on the top. It was an acacia wood box covered in gold. Now, interesting. Let's think about this. In the Chatzar, all the kelim were made of copper, in the Mishkan at least. In the Kodesh, they were all of gold. What's the difference between copper and gold? Aside from the fact that copper is an inferior metal, right? It's less valuable. It's connected to the nachash. There's something special about gold. In fact, it's actually considered something godly. Okay,
it won't.
Godly, same letters. Okay,
it won't contaminate.
It won't tarnish.
It won't tarnish.
It won't tarnish. Very good. So, why do I say that? There is a medrash that says that the world was not worthy to be able to use gold. Hashem created lots of things in this world for us to use, for the express purpose of us using them. But gold was considered something so special that it was not initially made for humans to benefit from. So why was it created? For the Mikdash. It was only created to be used in the Beis Hamikdash. But once Hashem created for use in the Beis Hamikdash, He allows us to use it personally as well. So unlike Nechoshes and Kesef, which was created for us to use, gold was created for the Beis Hamikdash, for the service of Hashem. And once that happened, we are also allowed to use it for ourselves. So Zahav represents, yes, it's a metal, but it's a metal which, number one, is more valuable, and it's considered, obviously, it's considered something godly, and that's why it corresponds to the Kodesh, which, as we're going to see, is a godly space. So that's in terms of the materials. Furthermore, when one looks in the Torah, when the Torah talks about these kelim, it uses the word zahav tahar. It doesn't say zahav, but zahav tahar, pure gold. The gold had to be smelted and not intensely to get it to absolute purity. That led to a number of tremendous miracles in the Beis Hamikdash, because gold itself is a very soft metal. That's why you get jewelry 14 karat, 18 karat. You don't really get 24 karat jewelry, because it would be too soft, it would lose its shape and it would break. The menorah was made of solid gold, pure gold. It was beaten into shape out of a kikar of zahav. Now, branches of that weight of gold would collapse. It sometimes happens with silver lighters. You see the branches kind of start to sag. With gold, it would happen, pure gold, kol sheken kal v'chomer. Miraculously, that did not happen. It was able to stand. But it's called zahav tar because here we're talking about purity. We're talking about something which is above tumah, something which is above coarseness and negativity. Okay, so let's now go to the next source. This is the Gemara Masechta Bava Basra, and this is actually brought in Shulchan Aruch as well. And the Gemara says as follows: Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Haroitze sheyachkim yadrim. If a person wants to become wise, obviously we're talking about being wise in Torah, yadrim, they should turn their face to the south. And this is talking about when davening Shemona Esrei. Obviously, we're facing Mizrach, or in Australia, what we call Mizrach, but it's not Mizrach. But you turn your head towards the south if you want to become wise. V'sheyashir, if you want to become wealthy, yatzbin, you turn your head to the north. V'simanech, what is the siman to remember this? Which direction I should face? Shulchan batzafin u'menorah b'darim. The shulchan, which represents bread, parnasa, sustenance, which is wealth, was on the north side of the Beis Hamikdash. So if you want wealth, you turn your face to the north. The menorah, which represents illumination, and as we're going to see, represents Torah and Chachma, Seichel, that was on the south. So if you want to have wisdom in Torah, you turn your head to the south. Okay, we'll leave the rest of it over here, but that's the source brought in the Gemara. It is brought by the Ramah in the Shulchan Aruch. But what do we learn from this? We learn from this that the menorah represents Chachma, Torah, represents spiritual, and the Shulchan represents the material. In fact, the Zohar says that the entire world was sustained by the Lechem Hapanim, that brought down the bracha for Parnasa for the entire world. So before we come back to that, what we'll now speak about is these three kalim. As opposed to in our lives, our avodah Hashem can be divided into two. We have our engagement within physicality, which is the avodah birurim, and that includes our avodah of controlling our nefesh bahamas and refining our nefesh bahamas, and that's in the mundane. That's doing things that are not innately holy, and our avodah is to do them l'shem shamayim. Our exercise, our eating, our drinking, our sleeping, etc., etc. But then we have our avodas Hashem, which is innately holy, and that is Torah and mitzvahs. The bulk of our days, I can ask Jewish women, the bulk of your days, where is it? In the Azara or in the Kodesh? In the mundane material or in the spiritual activities of Torah and mitzvahs? In the mundane. Now that's how it's supposed to be. That's why the bulk of the avodah in the Beis Hamikdash was actually in the Chatzar. But we also have to connect to Hashem through the spiritual. And when we talk about Torah and mitzvahs, al shloisha dvarim ha'olam oimed. Torah and mitzvahs, which represents avodah, which is innately holy. It doesn't need refining. Physicality, the guf, the nefesh bahamas needs refining. Torah, tefillah, staka does not need refining. Mitzvahs don't need refining. They are essentially holy, like the difference between copper and gold. So if Torah is divided into three kavim, Torah, avodah, and gemilas chasadim. Now what I'm about to say doesn't really correspond to the spheres in terms of this diagram. But if we were to take these three kalim, okay, we'll start off with the easy one. Which one represents gemilas chasadim? The shulchan, right? In fact, says that in the absence of the Mizbeach and the Beis Hamikdash, shulchanoi shel adam mechaper Allah. The shulchan of a person is mechaper for them through the mitzvah of hachnasas orchim. That brings atonement, brings kapara. So the shulchan, which represents physicality and represents the idea of giving nourishment, that corresponds to gemilas chasadim. In a broader sense, Chassidus tells us that gemilas chasadim is not just tzedakah, but in broader sense represents all physical mitzvahs. All fall under the gamut of gemilas chasadim. So that's the menorah. That's the kav of gemilas chasadim. The shulchan, sorry. That is the gemilas chasadim. That is mitzvahs that we do. Which one corresponds to Torah? The menorah. The menorah corresponds to Torah. Torah is Torah or, the idea of light and illumination. The menorah has 7 branches, which the Mefarshim and Tzemach Tzedek brings this, corresponds to the Torah Shebichsav, from which emanates the Shisha Starim of the Torah Shabal Peh, the 6 orders of the Torah Shabal Peh. That's the 7 branches. We could talk a lot more about that, but we're going to keep it brief. The menorah represents Torah. Obviously, that leaves the last one, which corresponds to Avodah, which represents Tefillah, and that is Ketores. What does Tefillah mean? Connection.
I'm sorry, but you said before that Tefillah was Torah.
The menorah is Torah. The shulchan is mitzvahs and particularly gemilas chasadim, and the mizbeach hakatores is tefillah. Tefillah comes from the lashon toifa, which means to connect. Ketores in Aramaic, keter means a knot, to bind oneself. Because in davening, right, that is when we reach, what's the ultimate objective of davening? Deveikus, to unite with Hashem, to connect with Hashem. As we say, tikon tefillasi, ketores lefanecha. That my tefillos should be placed as ketores before you. So mizbeach ketores represents the kav of tefillah. So if you notice, all of these 3 kalim are not about birurim, they're not about engagements within physicality. These are holy activities. They're connected directly to the service of Hashem. And we need to engage in all 3. So those are, that's reflected over there. So that's definitely one perspective. Now, how does the physicality of the shulchan fit in, aside from the fact that it represents Gemilas Chasad? So there's a difference. When was the lechem hapanim placed on the shulchan? On Shabbos. Chassidus explains there is a different kavana in the kavana of achila, of eating on Shabbos, than during the weekday. During the weekday, we eat for the purpose of birurim, to refine the godly spark, to elevate the godly spark that is within the physicality of the food, and to push away the klippa. And we do that by pushing away any desire we may have for the physicality of the food. Meaning, during the week, there is no essential mitzvah of eating. We do it as part of our avodah of birurim. And therefore, one only eats what is necessary. Comes Shabbos, however, Oineg Shabbos means lisanek, basar v'dagim v'chom matamim, to delight in Shabbos. That the achila is not for birurim. The achila itself is holy. The consumption, the eating itself is holy. That's how tzaddik eats the entire week. It says the pasuk tzaddik oichel l'soy v'nafshoy. The tzaddik eats to satisfy their soul, meaning that they eat purely because their neshama wants to eat that thing. They don't have to struggle with the nefesh bahamas. And on Shabbos, we all become elevated to that level, and that's why the eating is a mitzvah, and that's why one should have good quality foods and wine on Shabbos, more so even on Yom Tov. So the shulchan, yes, it represents physicality, but it's very different to the physicality of the azara. The physicality of the azara is you take a behema, which represents the nefesh bahamas, coarse material physicality that is not elevated, and we need to work on being mevarer to elevate it through the mizbech. The lechem hapanim represents a state where the physicality does not require birur anymore, just like Shabbos does not need birur. And this was actually alluded to in how the lechem hapanim was prepared. Lechem hapanim was made of flour, not just any flour. There had to be soiles, the finest flour. It had to be sifted 12 or 13 times. I don't recall which number. 12 or 13 times until you got the purest of the pure flour. So the flour that the lechem hapanim made out did not require any more birur, did not require any refining. That happened on Friday, right? It was represented physicality already in a pure sense, where that itself is a mitzvah. And that's like the physical mitzvahs that we do, that the gashmis, when we engage with physicality with a mitzvah, is not for the purpose of birurim. That's for the purpose of a mitzvah. It's not about like when we work, which has to be with a kavana l'shem shamayim. The physical mitzvah, be it wool with tzitzis, leather with tefillin, and esrei, galulav, a shofar, etc., the physicality itself is holy. And that's alluded to by the shulchan. Something else, we mentioned before that the chutzner, the courtyard, is the place of animals. That's the avodah with the behema, the animal. The bayis, the house, is the mother ha'adam. That's the place where man lives. So the azar of the Beis Hamikdash represents avodah with the behema, the nefesh bahamas, avodah birurim. And inside the Kodesh, in Kol Sheken, the Kodesh HaKadoshim, that is the place of man. If the behema is our nefesh bahamas, who is the adam inside of us? The neshama, the nefesh elikis. Because whereas when we engage in the physicality of the world, or we engage in refining our guf, we are engaging with our nefesh habahamas. It's an avodah of the nefesh habahamas. But when it comes to limud haTorah, when it comes to avodas hatfilah, when it comes to be mekayim mitzvahs and gemilas chasadim, that is the expression of the neshama. Or as the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, that what are the levushim of the nefesh elikis, machshav d'ramaisa? These are the taryag mitzvahs of the Torah and the mitzvahs d'Rabbanan. So whereas when we're in the outside, when we're in our mundane physicality interactions with the world, that is our dealing with our animal. When we engage in Torah, Tefillah, Staka, and mitzvahs, we are expressing our neshama. And that's why it's indoors. That's why it's inside the heichal. Okay, just conscious of the time. So if you look at this list, this is really a summary of some of the ideas that we've spoken about. So number one, the Kodesh is indoors as opposed to the Azara, which is outdoors, which represents that indoors is the avodah of man. And man represents the neshama, the nefesh elikis, which means we're talking about spiritual service. Not service that comes through interaction with physicality to refine it, but a spiritual service. All of the kalim, the vessels there, were of gold, more specifically zahav tahar, which is a godlike material, and it's a pure material. We have the three kelim, the shulchan, which is Gemilos Chasadim, the menorah, which represents Torah, the Mizbech HaKtoris, which is Tefillah. These are the three pillars in which all of Torah and mitzvahs can be divided, because these are the ways in which we serve Hashem in the Kodesh aspects of our lives. I was just thinking to myself now, the whole Beis Hamikdash is holy, right? But yet we don't call the Azara Kodesh, because relative to the Kodesh, it's not. Yes, relative to outside of the Beis Hamikdash, the Har HaBayis is holy, and the Azara is holy, and Ezras Nashim is holy, but it's not called Kodesh. Because whilst it's holy in that it's about serving Hashem, but it's about serving Hashem with the chol of our lives, the weekday of our lives. Interesting, the Zohar says that davening is a mini Shabbos within each day. Right? It's a me'ain of Shabbos when we daven. And the same is true when we learn Torah. Torah is synonymous with Shabbos as well, and so do our mitzvahs, because that is when we are in a state of kedusha. We're involved in something which is innately holy. So that is the Kodesh, and therefore this is divided into the three pillars of Torah. Washing, that's left there from last time, ignore that. Okay, so we mentioned that in terms of the worlds, this corresponds to Atzilus. That's where we have the primary spheres, because you also have Chesed, Gevurah, and Tiferes. That's alluded to by the three primary kelim. In truth, Chesed is connected to Gemilos Chasadim. Gevurah is connected to Avoida, because that's Milmata Lamaila. Gevurah goes from below to above. It doesn't correspond with the kelim. I mentioned that before. And Torah is connected to Tiferes. That's why it was given in the third month. Doesn't really correspond over here. In general, that refers to serving Hashem with our godly midos of our intellect and emotion. We use our intellect to study Torah. We use our intellect hispoinus during davening, but davening is primarily supposed to be emotional. Avas Hashem and Yiras Hashem. Okay, in terms of neshama, this corresponds to the level of chaya. We're not going to talk about that, but basically it's about even the physicality in the Kodesh is refined physicality. It's like the food of Shabbos. It's like the physicality of a mitzvah, that it's not for the purpose of birurim, but it has intrinsic holiness in and of itself. And that's spiritually the avoid of Torah mitzvahs. And then we get to ishapcha. The chutz, the courtyard, is about engaging with our nefesh Bahamas, and that's why you have iskafir. During the weekdays, you're supposed to have iskafir. And whilst, yes, of course, the analogy in Tanya is about food, but obviously iskafir means to push away your nefesh Bahamas, that it should not be a driver in your life, and the nefesh Bahamas becomes somewhat tamed. Shabbos, there is an ishapcha, there's a transformation. Just as there's no negativity in the world, and therefore there's no need for birurim, there is no need to engage with our nefesh Bahamas because we become elevated. And therefore, this is really a micro sense of being a tzaddik. The tzaddik, as I said before, eats like that the entire week because they've gone through an entire ishapcha where there's no longer an association with negativity or nefesh Bahamas. They only have that expression of kedusha. They don't have the behema, they only have the adam. And the Kodesh represents that level of avodah, and that's why you need to actually go up. You can't skip. You've got to go through the steps, right? Misha tarach be'erev Shabbos, yoichal b'Shabbos. And just saying, the Rebbe points out, very, very interesting. Very interesting. The Mizbeach Hazav, when they burned the Ketores, they burned it on coals. There were coals that were placed on top of the Mizbeach HaKetores, and then the Kohen would come and place the incense onto that. Where did the coals come from? From the Mizbeach HaChitzon. The Kohen would take coals from the Mizbeach HaChitzon, which is the avoid of Karbonis, and then bring that in. Now, the coals, it's after they've been burnt, meaning after you've gone through the avoid of Karbonis. Once you've been mevari your nefesh Bahamas, which is the avoid of the 6 days of the week of the Monday, and now you're left is just with the coals, the glow from that. That is the hachana that you can now come in and engage in the avodah of the Kodesh. That's what empowers us to do the avodah of the Kodesh, and that's why it needs to follow that process. So there's a chart at the bottom. You can look at that on your own, but these are just some ideas of what the Kodesh, its kelim, and avodah represents. Basic take home is whereas the outside, the chatzah, represents engagement with the physicality, and avodas habirurim, which includes our nefesh Bahamas, that's the karbonos. The Kodesh represents our engagement with our neshama, our nefesh elikis, in serving Hashem through the things that we do. And they are either Torah, the menorah, Avoida, the Mizbeach HaKtoros, Tefillah, or the Gemilas Chasadim and Mitzvahs, which are the Shulchan. Be'ezras Hashem, next week, we will look at the Kodesh HaKadashim and see how that is an even higher plane.
Just repeat the point about the coals. Because the coals that were burnt were taken from
the outside, from the courtyard, from the Mizbeach, into the Kodesh for the Ketoros, which means that is the Hachana, the Avodah Biru of Nefesh Bamis is the necessary Hachana to then bring that in. Thank you to all of those who joined us on Zoom, and look forward to having you again next time. I can't tell you right now how many we have over here. It's about 20 or so people. Okay, there was a question here. Why can't the Ketoros correspond to the Sphira of Gevura? It possibly could in some sense. Often you find contradictions in Chassidus. They're not contradictions. It depends what perspective you're taking. So in one perspective, this corresponds to Levushim, Seichel, Midos, and the Etzem and Neshama. In another perspective, it corresponds to Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, Chaya, and Yechid. It just depends what perspective we're kind of taking on things. So the perspective of the avoid of Torah, avoid the Gemilas Chasadim, yes, Torah is Tiferes, avoid is Gevura, and Gemilas Chasadim is connected to Chesed. In context of directions, north side, south side, the north is connected to Gevura. Why is that? Because north is the source of negativity. Mitzafin tipasach hara'a, negativity comes from the north, and our avoida of Gevura is to push that away. That's the left hand. That's why the left hand is the weaker hand. It's small, doicha. The right side, which corresponds to the menorah, if we were facing forward, that corresponds to that's the chesed in that sense. Because of the illumination. But then we have the Tiferes, which is in the center. And here we're talking about spatially the way it is in the Beis Hamikdash. The center corresponds to the Mizbeach HaKtoros. Tiferes is also about blending and synthesizing together. In fact, Chassidus explains that Tiferes is in fact higher than both Chesed and Gevura because it's in that middle column going all the way up to Keser. And that fits with the idea that Tefillah Avodah is what actually takes us up to the deepest connections with Hashem. So really just depending on which, I've taken ideas from different contexts. Depending on what the context is, it will be explained in a different way. But in terms of context of the layout of right side, left side, or north side, south side in the Mishkan, so the Mizbeach HaKtoros corresponds to Tiferes. But the Avodah of Ketoros could potentially correspond to Gevura as well. Okay.
Thank you very much. Before we to the Kodesh HaKadoshim, and then we're ready to enter the Beis Hamikdash.
Ready now.
Yes, we don't need to wait. We're ready now.